And Tim is in the. Should we go ahead and let everybody in? 12:59.
Yep. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to give another minute or two. Folks are still joining. Susan and Sadie, if you want to just take a look at the participants list and let me know when we've got the majority of folks.
Yeah, I would say we need to wait another minute or two for folks to finish joining. We do have someone that's joined us on the phone. 702-449-5479. That's
Yes.
your phone number. Would you mind speaking up?
Let's see, if you are muted, you can *6 will unmute you and you'll be able to speak.
Hi, yes, this is John. Hi, yes, this is John Lagarza.
Hi, John. Thanks for joining us.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, mm-hmm.
Mhm.
I think we're good to go, Kim.
Great. Tammy, you want to pull up the slides? Thank you, and welcome back, everybody, to our second stakeholder group meeting on wildfire adaptive communities. Next slide. Just a couple instructions just to review. Next slide. This session is being recorded as well as live streamed to the DLCD YouTube page. Your microphones have been muted on default. If you wouldn't mind leaving them muted for the meeting, unless you're speaking, and we will have plenty of time for discussion. One request: part of the purpose of the meetings is for discussion and to talk to one another and understand different perspectives in the community. So if you're in a place where you are comfortable to do so, if you wouldn't mind turning on your camera, just so we can see more faces, we'd really appreciate that. There will be multiple ways to engage throughout the meeting, including raising hands, chat. Please feel free to use the chat. We also have closed captioning turned on for this meeting. You can access that in a small button that says live transcript. It's at the bottom of your screen to the right of the green share screen button. We will also be doing some polling. And if you have any additional input or anything you don't feel comfortable sharing in the chat, please send to Susan Milhauser. We've included her email address below. Next slide, please. If you want to use the chat, you can do so at the bottom of your screen to the left of the share screen button. Just click chat. The default should be to send a message to everyone. If you wouldn't mind now experimenting with that, please send your name and the organization you're affiliated with, just so we can know who's on our meeting today. And next slide, Tim. And to raise your hand, which we'll be doing for the discussion portion, you can go to the reactions button on the bottom right of your screen, even to the right of the live transcript button. And then there's a raise hand button. And then that will let us know that you'd like to speak, and we'll call on folks. And next slide. So today we'll have our welcome. We'll go through, talk about the wildfire risk map and then how to incorporate that at the local level. We want to hear your input. And then we have some implementation considerations that we'd like to discuss with you. And we'll close out with some next steps. I'm going to turn it over to Susan Milhauser.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Susan Milhauser with DLCD, the Natural Hazards Wildfire Planner and Project Coordinator for our Wildfire Adapted Communities Project. And we're really glad you are all here with us today to share your unique views and ideas. And as you can see on the screen, this is kind of the charge of our Wildfire Adapted Communities Stakeholder Group, really trying to bring together community members who have been directly and indirectly impacted by wildfire in Oregon, as well as other experts and representatives from some statewide organizations to help inform DLCD's recommendations, which will be shared with the statewide Wildfire Programs Advisory Council, as well as the legislature. And this, it really is important to hear from all of you, your unique experiences and viewpoints to help us develop recommendations to increase the safety of our communities. Next slide, please. All right, so I kind of did this already, but and so I think, again, welcome. We really are glad to have folks here today. We have 2 hours, so feel free to speak up when we get to the discussion parts, either, again, verbally or with the chat. Also, I will note that we have a short survey we're putting together that we'll be sharing with everyone after the meeting to get any additional feedback you might have for folks who missed the meeting and are watching it by live stream, if they want to, or recording afterwards, provide feedback about what we discussed today, as well as any kind of some general questions about how the meeting went. So we're always looking for feedback so we can keep improving this process. And so now I am going to pass it over to Sadie Carney.
Thank you, Susan. I think you guys can hear me. I'm sorry for folks on the phone. I've been having some audio issues today. So if I get confused on which mute button to use, I apologize. But I'd like to read the land acknowledgement as we open our meeting. I'd like to acknowledge the many tribes and bands who call Oregon their ancestral territory and honor the ongoing relationships between the land, plants, animals, and people indigenous to this place we now call Oregon. We recognize the continued sovereignty of the 9 federally recognized tribes who have ties to this place and thank them for continuing to teach us how we might all be here together. I think we can go to the next slide. And then I want to thank Susan for putting together this slide. And, as we acknowledge the tribal nations who we consult with in our work, I also wanted to acknowledge the differences between the people that are involved in this conversation and at this table, and Oregon as a whole. And so we thank you for those of you, I think it's most of you who filled out the demographic information in our application form. It helps us understand how this group is or is not representative of Oregon as a whole. So you can see that our stakeholder group is comprised of about 13% of participants who have a household income under $60,000 annually. And in Oregon, that's really 1 in 2. And our stakeholder group has 3% participating who identify as living with a disability. But in Oregon, that's 1 in 4. Our stakeholder group is 7% representatives who identify as being people of color. And again, in Oregon, that's almost 1 in 4. And our stakeholder group, 1 in 10 of us is a renter. And in Oregon, 40% of Oregonians rent and don't own their homes. So we put this slide together just as we are moving forward in these conversations. Just a reminder for us to think about who is participating in this conversation and who is not. So I hope that's helpful for folks. It's helpful for me. And I think we can move on to our next slide. Thank you.
Stating
All right. Okay, this is where we call on our guest speaker, Tim Holschbach from the Oregon Department of Forestry. And Tim has graciously joined us today to talk about the mapping and rulemaking that ODF is currently undertaking to develop the wildfire risk map for the state of Oregon in conjunction with Oregon State University. So take it away, Tim.
Thank you, Susan, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to join you. For this one, as many folks do know, the Department of Forestry and OSU have been undertaking the development of rules and as well as the mapping product to meet the Section 7 and Section 34 portions of Senate Bill 762. So the wildfire risk mapping and wildland urban interface. A lot of that work that's been ongoing feeds into the discussion that's happening today and helps inform and set that kind of the first step in that process to find some answers to the questions or visually see where the questions being posed have impacts. Next slide, please. So Section 7 of Senate Bill 762 requires Department of Forestry to oversee the development, maintenance of a comprehensive wildfire risk map, and it also inclusive of the wildland urban interface boundaries and wildfire risk classes. And all that work's to be done by June 30th of 2022. With that as well is it includes a layer of socially vulnerable communities, and those are also that are economically vulnerable. As I mentioned, this map as its base feeds into many of the other actions of multiple entities that have responsibility under Senate Bill 762, everything from where to focus of the landscape scale mitigation work, small woodland grant programs, where DEQ focuses their NOHA on the public health aspects of the bill, as well as DLCD's work. Next slide, please. So with that, getting ahead of the slide deck even. So as I mentioned, there's those risk classifications, the overlay of the wildland urban interface, and that socially and economically vulnerable communities layer that overlays and sets the foundation of where other agencies have responsibilities, including the fire marshal and DLCD, as well as DCBS with the building codes, as well with some of the other agencies that are in the bill. I believe there's about a dozen state agencies in that particular bill that had responsibilities. So this first one of the map is the deadline for that is June 30th. So about 6 more weeks left for that to be completed. So next slide, please. The wildland urban interface that definition was adopted by the Board of Forestry on October 20th. It means the geographic area where structures and other human development meets or intermingles with wildland or vegetative fuels. To supplement that definition, the department was undertaking an administrative rulemaking process to establish criteria to identify and classify that wildland urban interface. Next slide, please. Along with that, the bill specified that there will be 5 wildfire risk class categories: no risk, low, moderate, high, and extreme. What you see on some pictures on the right, there was during the rulemaking initial RAC process, we were working through what values to take, what criteria and considerations to take place into the consider wildfire risk as it applies on the landscape. And so we primarily discussed burn probability and wildfire intensity as the two. You can see how they have different effects on fire regimes around the state. And it provides a little, while wildfire intensity is high, or burn probability is higher on the east side, where we have a short rotation fire regime, and the blue is the longer rotation on the west side of the state. That changes over with the intensity, where we have heavier fuel loading on the west side of the state and lighter flashy fuels on the east side. So those two criteria seem to create a balance with of what to draw from for the fire potential on the landscape. Next slide, please. So the rule package itself that were presented to the board back in March to go out to public hearing were broken down to the following several sections. You can see them listed here. I'm not going to go into the details for each of the sections, but it was broken down to help with the ease of identifying an order, having an orderly rule package. Next slide, please. As well, trying to identify and break out between the wildland urban interface rules and those that pertain to the wildfire risk map. Along with those two subjects, there's also integration of a notification process and an appeal process for property owners that they can appeal their assignment of wildfire risk. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, what the legislation directs the department and OSU to do is to assign a wildfire risk designation at the property ownership level to all properties within the state of Oregon. With those, there will also be an area identified as being the wildland urban interface, and that'll be designated as well and overlaid on the wildfire risk map. And then with that overlay, there are provisions for folks who are in higher extreme risk class and also within the wildland urban interface that they may be subject to defensible space provisions developed by the Office of State Fire Marshal, and as well as potentially building codes provisions established by DCBS. So there were additional work to feed into those two specific areas. Next slide, please. So that the final draft rules will be presented to the Board of Forestry for adoption June 8th. Currently, the department is reviewing all of the comments submitted by the public on that rule package, and we'll be presenting the results to the board on the 8th. Assuming the board does approve the presented rules, we'll be looking at doing the filing after that, and then have an effective date for the rule package for June 30th. And then any additional comments and questions can be either sent to me, or we do have a rulemaking, an email box to talk about all the provisions of Senate Bill 762 and the multiple facets of rulemaking with that as well. So feel free to write down that email address if you think you might have some questions later. Next slide, please.
Sadie?
Oh. There, let me get unmuted here. Perfect timing, because I actually have a question for Tim. Let me lower my hand here. And that was, Tim, can you remind me, and maybe you covered this, but you have that presentation so down that I might have missed it. And that is for notification, just because we're moving on to next steps here about how the map gets used in local planning. But the notification process notifies property owners who are in the WUI, who are also high or extreme risk. Is that who you're notifying?
No, the WUI designation has no bearing on who gets notified. It's the individuals who are either identified as in high or in extreme. So there will be, I use the south side of Harney County as an example. I know there's high fire. Someone out there is going to have a high fire risk designation. More than likely, they will not be in the WUI. They will still receive a notification because the bill directs us to notify those in high or extreme.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. That is really helpful to me. And just for the benefit of our stakeholder group here, one thing that I know came up in the conversation as our colleagues at ODF were doing the difficult work of leading the rulemaking that will result in the map was ODF is not funded by the legislature to do broader notification. So that's just something I think for us to think about is who is aware of the map and kind of how the map affects them or where the map is affecting. And right now it's limited just to property owners. So if there is a renter in that space, that's not somebody who is required to be provided notification under Senate Bill 762. So as we think about implications of incorporating this at a local level, maybe that's something that we try to keep in mind. Okay, so this is actually my section of the presentation as well. And we're going to talk about.
I thought we might ask if anyone else has questions for Tim before we.
Fair. Great reason to pause.
If you do, feel free to raise your hand, or you can send messages in the chat. I saw one question come in that I think Susan answered.
I think maybe, sorry, I was just going to say Tim, there was a question about the rules that are going to the commission. So I included the link to your rulemaking page. Does that have the most up-to-date information?
So that the rules on that page were the ones that went to public hearing and that the public commented on. Currently, the ones presented to the board on June 8th are still being prepared. We're still reviewing all the comments received and looking at areas to add clarity to that rule package or any other comments that were taken into consideration. So as soon as those are prepared, they will be posted online as well.
Is there a date certain by which those will be available, Tim?
As soon as possible. We want to get them in front of the board as well so that the board members have time to review them prior to the meeting. So with let's see, that's 3 weeks from now, and the department's moving as fast as we can to get through work through the comments we've received.
Sure, no, I understand that. Is there a date by which you would be required to have that information available in advance of the Board of Forestry hearing?
I believe generally it's 10 to 14 days, and I'm trying to think of which one of those two. So yeah, and with that will also be the staff report that walks through and any a summary of any changes that were made from what the board saw in the March meeting to what they saw in the June meeting.
Okay, and last question from me, and then I see Sharice has her hand up, and that is the landowner notification also required to be complete by June 30, or does that happen afterward?
Nope, that's required to be completed by June 30th.
Okay, very good, thank you. Sharice, go ahead.
I am curious whether the consideration criteria includes differences in home quality construction like trailer parks. The poorer communities tend to congregate and are more dramatically affected because of the quality of their home construction. And is that considered in the risk analysis?
So the type of home or material is not a consideration in does not contribute to wildfire risk or the risk classification.
And why is that?
Is the criteria that the Rules Advisory Committee was working through was wildfire behavior. So it's it takes into account we're limited in scope of criteria to consider to climate, weather, topography, and vegetation. Those were what was outlined in the legislation of what we can consider in building the fire risk model.
Can we provide any comments suggesting that be reconsidered?
I certainly think this is a good segue to a place where we would make recommendations because building codes and defensible space standards are within the purview of what Senate Bill 762 has asked DLCD to advance recommendations on. So really, ODF had a very challenging job in establishing a map using the criteria. And I think they've pulled it off, or very nearly. They're getting ready to land the plane. And then, I'm grateful you're here with this idea and these comments, because it's really our charge to look at how this is further implemented on the ground, both in terms of dispensable space and building codes, additional data needs that are necessary, like a record of building materials and where different building materials are used, and a lot of other considerations that I hope we'll get to. So thank you very much for the comment. So our next or first topic here is now we have heard at least a summary of what the map is, how it functions, when it will be available. And I think we're all aware that at this point, we're kind of operating in the dark. We have an idea of what the map might look like, but nobody's going to see it until the end of June. That said, we do have the requirement in Senate Bill 762. I think we can go to the next slide, to make recommendations about updates to the statewide land use planning program and local comprehensive plans and zoning codes to incorporate the wildfire risk map in a way that minimizes wildfire risk and includes, and then at some point we will get to the appropriate levels of funding. And I know we have folks on this call who are going to be very valuable in that. But as we're thinking about how we should incorporate the wildfire risk map, it's, I think, on the one hand, problematic that we don't have a map in front of us to look at. But on the other hand, I think it does give us some freedom to operate in a little bit more theoretical space and think about what a best practice might look like, rather than what on the ground implementation will have in terms of effects. So we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So our question, and we have sort of a 3-step process outlined on the right, is the considerations that DLCD is evaluating or asking this group to evaluate. We'll have a polling exercise, and our friend Kim at Barney and Worth will lead us through that. And then we'll open it up for discussion from this group, because it's really the experts on this call and the voices that are in this conversation that are critical to giving us feedback so that we can develop these recommendations in a way that is broadly representative of the interests that are part of this conversation. So the question is, how can the forthcoming wildfire risk map be used to reduce wildfire risk to people, public and private property, businesses, infrastructure, and natural resources? And so we came up with a couple of considerations. We can go to the next slide, please. That we thought of. There may be things that we haven't thought of that you think we should consider, and we're happy to take those into account. But broadly, we could implement the map in a couple of different ways. We could have one consistent map. We could adopt the Board of Forestry or the ODF OSU wildfire risk map at a state level and sort of hand it down to local governments, or we could have a community-driven process where each local government adopted the map. So one, they would both, I think, need to go through a public process that had the opportunity for comment, because in Oregon, land use decisions require that. But one would happen at the state level, and the other would be a more localized process. And depending on what you think of, burdens, one could be perceived as relieving a burden from local government and putting the process in state hands. On the other hand, it could be perceived as top down and not something that local governments are that in favor of. And so there's definitely some pros and cons. So to give folks an idea of what a consistent map that is handed down from the top would look like, our National Flood Insurance Plan, or our NFIP maps. So our floodplain maps that we get from FEMA are handed down from the top. They are adopted at a local level so that communities can participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. So if folks have questions about that, happy to do my best to answer them, though I have a lot of folks on the call that could help me. So then the next, Samantha, why don't you go ahead, and Mary Kyle.
Sure. I was just wondering if maybe the department could take the time walking through, I think it's kind of what you're doing, some of the pros and cons of both as it may impact property owners. I know we have a lot of good examples from the FEMA process, but maybe you could help elaborate a little bit more on both these options.
I could, but I would be more in favor of hearing what you think the pros and cons would be. I'm really here to get feedback at this point. I'm happy to do my best to elaborate, but because I haven't seen the map, it's hard for me too. And so,
yeah,
so one challenge that I can talk about is with a map that is adopted at DLCD. We still have some curiosity that we are trying to sort out with our DOJ consultant about whether or not we can adopt a map by reference, or and just say, oh, we need to use the most updated one, or if we would need to adopt them, do the whole process again every 5 years when it's updated. And then how that would work with the reference to a building codes tool that is attached to the map but not part of the map. How could we reference that? There's a lot to sort out at that level, but there will be a lot at a community driven level as well. So it's not a very great answer, but I would love to. There's a lot of hands up, so maybe we could hear other folks' question and we'll get closer to an answer together.
Yeah, see, I'll just quickly say, I think this is hard to do because it feels like a little bit like it's a chicken and an egg issue. It's hard to say, you know, how should the map be adopted when we don't know what adopting the map means for communities and property owners and building applications. So I'll just say that it's a little bit hard to conceptualize how we should do it when we don't know what that really means yet.
I completely understand. I mean, I think what we can rely upon is what Tim shared with us and the legislative intent that was laid out in Senate Bill 762. And that is that the map will help us understand where there is greater fire risk. And the map will help us understand what is and is not considered to be within the wildland urban interface, right? And we know that our charge is to use the information in that map to protect communities. But you're right, it is a vague space at this point, and there are a lot of challenges in this process. I could not agree more. Mary Kyle, did you want to go ahead? Oh, sorry, Samantha, were you finished?
No, that's yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Sadie. So I just want to clarify that it is going to be a statewide map of wildfire risk and the WUI. That's what the Department of Forestry is and OSU are creating. So it is going to be statewide, and certain things are going to apply statewide by Senate Bill 762, the building codes and the defensible space, right?
Correct.
Okay, so otherwise, so the map, I think, is adopted statewide. And I think maybe the issue, maybe it's a little bit more nuanced for us, is how do any things that may come out of this group, recommendations, any land use recommendations themselves apply? I don't see it as a matter of the map applying, but how the implementation of it applies. And there might be some land use things that should be statewide and other ones that should be local. So for example, maybe there's things about evacuation routes or roads or things like that that should be of a statewide nature, at least in all areas that are higher extreme or in the WUI or something, you know, no matter what, that's something that should be consistent across the state. Whereas other land use requirements maybe are more localized. So it seems to me that until that it is a statewide map, certain things are going to apply statewide by virtue of Senate Bill 762. And then the various land use requirements, guidelines, et cetera, it seems to me should vary depending on what the content of it is, as to whether they're statewide or local. Mm-hmm. But the map itself is the map and it's statewide. So that's just, anyway.
Yeah, if I may just, so one way that we have heard from members of our hazards team that a more localized process may differ from kind of the general map that applies across the state is in existing community wildfire protection plans. Some communities have already mapped areas that they consider to be in the wildland urban interface. And those boundaries may vary. They may be more inclusive. For example, I don't think, based on what I know of this kind of sort of state-local relationship, that they could be more permissive but a locally developed map could potentially be more restrictive. So I know, for example, that the city of Ashland right now, and I think we have some folks from Ashland on the call, has a WUI overlay for the city of Ashland. Well,
Right.
should we allow the city of Ashland to say this is all the WUI, or do they need to have two different definitions of what is the WUI? One that is based on ODF's definition and one that is based on locally, and does that create problems for implementation? So that's I think more what we were thinking of when we
Oh,
thought of this sort of contrast in these implementation questions. I'm not sure if that's helpful, but
No, that's useful because it is the map itself as opposed to a land use requirement of it. And it does seem that in other cases that we've had we've used a protocol that if it's more restrictive, you can do it, but not if it's more loose. I was thinking more, for example, maybe hospitals should never be located in a high or extreme wildfire area. I mean, I'm just picking on that, so that like you'd think in the tsunami zones or some other hazard zones where there are certain things where you don't want high concentrations of people who are at risk living or in a situation where they're at risk, such as in a hospital. So that's what I was thinking. Those sorts of things some things may be a statewide standard, but some may vary locally. But,
yeah, one of the questions that we have coming up, you're kind of like anticipating them, I think, is what should the map protect? So how do we use the information that's in the map or that it's exposed by the map to help us protect the things that are important to us? I see Kelly O'Neill next in my queue.
I just had two questions. I think one of them was something that somebody else just asked, what would happen if a local community chose not to adopt the map? And then the second question I have is, FEMA mapping was brought up. How are these maps going to affect property owner insurance rates? Or do we know that yet? Because I know that will be a question that comes up a lot at the local level.
Yeah, and I don't think I mean, beyond what is in the legislation as written, I think it is kind of a question that we are here to make recommendations about, and that is how property owners will be affected. So Senate Bill 762 says that people who are located within the wildland urban interface and are in high or extreme risk areas must employ defensible space standards that are set by the Oregon State Fire Marshal. And also, if there is a significant remodel or new development on a property, there are certain building standards that they must use to fire harden the structure. And so that's how property owners are affected, basically, like just cleanly in the legislation, and then there are kind of tertiary questions that come with concerns around the map, and that is how might it affect my ability to insure my home, or how might my neighbors, being in a medium risk category when I'm in a high risk category, how does him not having to do anything to protect his home or his property or establish defensible space, does that put me at greater risk? And so there's those kind of considerations, but just the legislation itself requires defensible space and building codes.
So the reason I asked that is because I think without knowing how it will impact property insurance rates, I don't know, from being a local planner the last almost 2 decades now, I don't know how most jurisdictions, especially smaller jurisdictions that have a lot of fire risk properties, I think they're going to be very hesitant to adopt maps without knowing how those maps could impact insurance rates for people and how it could affect home ownership, basically.
Right. And so, but but that is what we are here to make recommendations on. So I think it's fair to capture that concern, and sort of say local governments will need to know this kind of information, or we will need to have this information in hand before we can consider how the map is implemented. But unfortunately, we don't have that information right now, so we can just form it as a recommendation, if that makes sense. And so
Yes,
I hear the concern, and I understand the challenge. But that's why we're here together, to try to answer these questions. Is what are the barriers? What are the issues that we need to look out for? And how might we solve them? What recommendations can we make that would address those concerns?
Yeah, so I guess that would be my input then, is that I think it should be, the map adoption should be driven by the results of those, the determination around insurance, because I think otherwise, I think local communities are going to have a real hard time adopting them. So I guess that is my input, I guess.
Okay, I'm having a little trouble hearing you, so I'm having to read the closed captions, which are hearing you just fine. But thank you for that. And Jim, I see your hand up next.
Yeah, thank you for that. Jim McCauley, Legislative Director of the League of Oregon Cities. So I think we've already kind of talked about it. This is probably not going to be just a simple, clean adoption process where you just have a state mapping effort. So there's going to need to be some kind of steps at that local level for updates, for opportunities for those communities that want to perhaps go beyond some of the protective measures. And that was also something that was quite consistent with certainly our input during the session, is essentially a locally driven process, or at least an opportunity to localize the details that are going to be coming out at the state level for both WUI, but also the high risk maps and things of that nature. It's just kind of a check and balance value, I think, at the local level. I think part of that too, sorry for the hoarseness, lots of talking today, is that not all communities that are out there have got the resources, and that will need to be part of that consideration. So if you look at a city like Butte Falls, we use as an example, obviously surrounded by forest land, their resources that they can bring to the table for any kind of planning updates are going to look a lot differently than City of Eugene, as an example, or Springfield, or some of the other communities that might be or might have some land that runs up next to potentially some of these higher risk areas. So that's at least something to consider in terms of identifying resources that are going to need to be part of the implementation strategy, and I think are physically, we'll just say, allocated as a result of 762 implementation over time. So thank you.
Can I ask just a follow up quickly? Would I know that our cities are under so much pressure to respond to different rulemaking packages and legislation that is sort of coming through. Would there be any relief provided by having a statewide map and not a community-driven process, and sort of allowing the community-driven process to determine sort of zoning codes and, maybe they want to expand defensible space standards into areas that are at medium risk or something like that? I'm just trying to think of ways that we could, like, if there is to be some level of unfunded mandate or funded, right? We come up with funding. Is there a balance in there where the state does part of the lift and it's an assist to local governments?
Yeah, I think that's fair. My expectation is, and again, some of the other cities on the phone here can certainly object, but I don't see a complete remapping process at the local level. So you're going to start with a statewide map for both WUI and for also these risk maps. That's going to be an overlay, across the landscape, and for the overlay that has an impact on a city boundary or within a UGB, as an example, is really kind of that role of where there's that additional refinement. So I think certainly any additional resources that can help would be of benefit. But again, I don't expect this to be a clean process that is going to be duplicated from, or a city's response is going to be duplicated from one city to the next. It's all going to come down to what type of resources they're going to have physically at the table, and also what type of an impact this has within their community. It may be 2 or 3 acres. It may be 400 or 500 acres. But again, we're not going to know the scope of this impact until we see these maps.
Right. Thank you. Your clarification was really helpful. I appreciate that. I have Katie Skakel next in line.
Yeah, thanks. And excuse me if I might have missed this, but I didn't hear enough, and maybe it's in the literature that you sent out, about what science went into creating the maps. What scale is it at? What have you done as far as the topo and areas? I know it's that you discussed it talking about wildfire behavior and what that includes, but is there any possibility of going into a little bit more about how you're creating the maps and the science behind the maps?
That is a question for our friend Tim Holschbach from ODF, who is here. And I know he played a very, very important role in convening this group with the scientists whose excellent data went into building the map and is going into building the map right now, or at OSU. And unfortunately, none of them were available to participate in this meeting today. We are going to look at a screen capture of the existing Wildfire Explorer that OSU has hosted online later in this presentation. And we can put that link in the chat if folks want to go and look at the map that exists today. It is not going to be a 1-for-1 sort of comparison or corollary to the map that will become available, but you can look at the data that was used to build the map, and you can kind of dive into the metadata and see how old the data was, on what best practice the data is based, what research they're using to support utilization, and kind of how it works among the other bodies of data. I have very, very little concern about the science that is going into the map. I can say that. But if folks are curious, that is a place to satisfy your curiosity. Unfortunately, I don't have the vocabulary to scientifically defend the OSU map, but I know they do.
And I just want to, just jump in just to talk about the time. We're at 1:45. We have this discussion planned until 2:10. So just thinking about that as we go forward.
Thank you, Kim. Let's hear from the folks that have their hands up, and then hopefully we can breeze through our next question and get to polling. We're kind of taking it in reverse order because we do have some polling questions to get a temperature in the room, and then we have more time for discussion after that, but I don't think it's hugely problematic if we take it out of order. So Kurt.
Thank you. Kurt Wilson. I'm an architect in Eugene. And what is helping me as I'm making some notes here and trying to define this conversation a little better is thinking about this term adoption or concept of adoption, and both in the purpose or the definition of the map is one thing and the use of the maps are another. And I think that the idea that City of Ashland or others who kind of got ahead of this process are going to have kind of come up with their own maps and their own definition of terms is long-term problematic to me. And then I think the purpose of this map is that it's a science-based map that is statewide, and it's a structure that we're defining, and that there can be and should be more localized and more granular definition of the map that can be built into it, but that there's not these different definitions and different boundaries. It has to be scalable. And if we use it, the FEMA example is a great one, because FEMA maps are very kind of big picture, and any property might where wetland or floodplain definitions might occur. There's much more site-specific information that can be provided that can be better clarify where floodplain areas are on properties, and there's a process in place. And I think something like that that process needs to be incorporated. So to me, that's a scalable issue that needs to happen. I think the use of the maps is where the politics really is. And to me, if we can differentiate use from purpose or definition, get the politics out of the definition and allow the politics to be around the use, I think that's a better for all of us. I look at how communities are adopting House Bill 2001 recently, and this idea that you have a period of time and you have to at minimum adopt the minimum state requirements, but you can exceed that. And Eugene's going through our own process. Something will happen tomorrow related to that at the council work session. I think something like that needs to be followed here, and that there's a period of time where there's some basic requirements that have to be incorporated. And that probably has to be done over years, not months, for that to happen. And then within that, more structure can occur. So I think we should be looking to the fullest extent possible at existing processes that we're using and follow that. But ultimately, this is about real risk. And it's to say, respond to a real risk unless it's too inconvenient, then don't worry about it, is not what I would hope not what we see. Building codes don't do that, and building codes have a good process, and there's processes. It's like, this doesn't really apply to me here. But I think we need to recognize that this is real. These are real risks, and we need to have processes that recognize it.
Thank you. Dave.
Thank you, Sadie. I'm trying to figure out, and I realize I think you're looking at section whatever 11 or 12 of 762 to figure out what the agency's charge here is, but I'm trying to figure out what you all believe the agency's charge here is. It sounds like we're talking about the function here of the agent of this group and the agency to second guess the DCBS hardening standards, the defensible space standards that are adopted by the state fire marshal, and the choice for both high extreme wildfire risk map by ODF and the WUI map that's also being created by ODF. And I don't think we can do that. I think the bill only gives local government the ability to expand defensible space. And I'd hate to start going down the path of talking about either this agency or local governments expanding or creating a new WUI map or new defensible space standards or recommending to the legislature that we essentially ignore what those other agencies have done and the hard work that they've done and substitute this agency standards for those. So I'm a little concerned about that, and I'd like to flesh that out in a little. If you folks could flesh that out in a little more detail, I think it'd be helpful for us.
Yeah, it's Susan. Do you want to take it, or I'm happy to respond?
Well, no, just to clarify. So under our charge, we are not talking about any changes to the defensible space standards or the building codes that are being developed by our sister agencies. Yeah, that's not part of our charge, but we, under Senate Bill 762, DLCD can make recommendations, about additional places where those standards might apply. And as you mentioned, Dave, there is, kind of it's not a carve out, but like a local government could, through a local process, decide they want to make zoning code or development code updates to require defensible space in all the risk categories. So, DLCD wouldn't necessarily say they have to do that, but we do want to make sure in our recommendations, we note that that is something that a local government could do under Senate Bill 762. So yeah, to be very clear, we're not looking at any different mapping or WUI boundaries or definitions or changes, to codes that the other agencies are working on. It's really more about, recommendations, how local governments can use this information. So they may want to do more detailed mapping if they feel like that, that they have through their community wildfire protection plans, like for a specific area plan or, another type of application. But no, yeah. So just to make that super clear, we're not looking at those more broad recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, and not only that, that isn't within our agency authority to direct, right? We can't establish a building code at DLCD that doesn't fall within DLCD's authority, nor can we establish defensible space standards. But we are asked in the legislation to advance recommendations on those topics. So we're trying to respond to the legislation as best we can.
So if I can follow up quickly, Sadie or Susan, and Susan, I appreciate that answer. Do you believe, and is one of the things that this group is going to talk about, whether or not to recommend that local governments be entitled to essentially ignore the WUI maps that are statewide WUI maps that have been created and create their own? I think that's what I heard you say, and I hope that's not the direction that we're going. I don't think the bill allows that, but
that would not be a recommendation that I think we would put forth. No, because I think there is a requirement that local governments are using those maps for building codes and defensible space. So that is required, yes.
Okay.
And then
great.
we're looking at more broadly like land use implications. So.
Yeah, right.
And
okay.
I think further, DLCD is directed to minimize wildfire risk or make recommendations that would minimize wildfire risk. And I think asking local governments to ignore information that is included in a map, including areas that are at increased risk because they're in the wildland urban interface, would be counter to the assignment that we have before us in Senate Bill 762.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you. Rubio?
Hi, everyone. Yes, so one of the things that continued to catch my eye on this is, I don't know if you guys can hear me okay or not. Yeah, okay. So this is the digital map that we're going to use throughout the community, assuming that they all have reliable internet. Is that true? I mean, I'm thinking like, we all are assuming that people can have access to this digital thing on what platform? On a laptop platform or on a mobile platform? Mm-hmm. That will be my recommendations, to really think about how people are going to access this, because we can have a great discussion about how many maps we can create, but if people are not using them, then are useless. And the other part of that is, I'm a gamer, and we have played with beta platforms. Beta platforms allow us to really figure out the kinks, what works and what doesn't work. And I will say there is a combination of both, having the digital map with a beta phase that can allow a generation of people that can navigate through the map and kind of beta test it, so it can work out the kinks for older generations that have a hard time to actually access that information. If you ask me, I'm in Dallas, Oregon. I have very poor internet, and I'm in Dallas, Oregon, in Polk County. My internet sucks really bad. For me to download a map and follow your train of thought is really far-fetched, because I'm thinking, I use Google Maps already. I use other maps. People are getting used to these other maps interactions. Do we really need to reinvent the wheel, or do we need to create a wheel that is already out there that could be used by everyone, not just the youngest, but also the older? Because I continue to face that, where I continue to talk to my mom and had to use Google Maps and all that, and it's a struggle. But I'm just getting the assumption here that, yes, everybody understands how it works, everybody understands technology, everybody has internet, and that is not true. across the board. So I'm just bringing those up because I like the fact that, yes, it's not. And I just want to share this link that I put on the chat. And I went through something that it was unspoke for. My shed got on fire, my well house. I lost the water to my house in 5 acres, and my shed got on fire. If you look at that link, and if you look at the picture that they took, the fire and all of that, if you see the trees behind that, if that fire would have happened in August, this would cause a wildfire in this tree farm that I am all around. So I am all about cleaning out the space, making sure that every fire structure doesn't create a wildfire, et cetera, et cetera. But you guys are talking about a map that doesn't really help me with my fire prevention for my small structures. I mean, the reality check on that is I felt vulnerable. I couldn't put out the fire. I had to wait for the fire department to get here. That is volunteer based. I'm in Polk County and I have a volunteer based fire department that took 25 minutes to get here. The shed got destroyed. There was nothing to rescue. Reality is I need to have an independent water system away from my well house so I can have a chance to fight or at least throw something at it. These are things that are not, I used to think we were Superman and no, nothing's going to happen to us here. And that is not true. So me being in this position when I'm in this group and also went through a fire myself, it really taught me the hard bites of where can a wildfire start. And this is, I mean, we were wet, it's a wet season. And if you see the picture, there's a tree behind it. If it was a different time, we would have talked about a major disaster here in Polk County. So just putting it out there as far as, because this is my concern of how people are going to actually access this. And I like the politics behind all of this are great, but the accessibility is my biggest concern with the actually make this happen. So that's where I'm at. And thank you for listening.
It's a great comment. Thank you. Kim, why don't you open up the poll so that people can get a look at the first question and we'll hear from you
I have
at the same time. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I just had a final comment if I can.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask Kim to get the polling ready
Okay.
while we were listening to your comment. So go ahead.
I just want to tack on to what Dave was saying and talk a little bit about the charge of 762. I know that it's been said here, what I'm hearing is that the department feels like it must discuss building codes and defensible space. The charge of 762, that is not a must, it's a may in section 3. You can talk about that if the department wants to. That's not a requirement. This group does not have to talk about those type of things. The only charge is that it has to talk about incorporating the statewide wildfire risk maps and talking about updates to our planning system. So given just the sheer amount of volume of this topic and the limited amount of time that we have, my recommendation would be that we focus on our planning system and start talking about ways that our planning system isn't working, because I don't think we're really identifying that, and not spend our time talking about building codes and defensible space when that's certainly within the purview of other departments, especially because we don't have to be making recommendations on those.
That's a fair comment. Thank you.
So Sadie, I did put up the first poll question, and this is getting to a lot of what the comments that we were talking about over the last half hour of how should the wildfire map be implemented? Should it be consistent across the state or more of that community-driven process? Please select one. We have a little less than half of the folks who have selected an option right now. So I'll give you another minute to consider.
And I'll just add that the poll is really just to get a temperature check, and you may not have enough information. Clearly, we're all lacking some information, but we're just trying to get some feedback, if there's any type of direction.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So we do have about over half of folks in the room think it should be implemented consistently across the state. A few think it should be more of a community-driven process, and a lot of folks saying not sure. And I know a lot of comments have come up recent in the conversation about why you're not sure, but if anyone didn't have a chance to comment and you'd like to talk about what other information that you would want to have in order to feel that you could say something about this topic, if you wouldn't mind putting that in the chat, that would be really helpful. Sadie or Susan, do you have any other comments?
No, I really appreciate the feedback. Maybe if it makes sense with you, Susan, and with you, Kim, maybe we could just go right to the next poll question and then bring it back to discussion with the group.
So we want to talk about, so it sounds like folks would prefer that statewide solution. How effective do you think that would be? Very effective, somewhat effective, not effective, or unsure? And then if you would like to put in the chat why you're thinking that way, that would be really helpful for this conversation and for DLCD.
I'll just say it's hard to answer that question when I'm not entirely sure what implementation of the map means.
I agree with Sam. I'm still unsure what adopting beyond the purpose of the maps under 762 even means.
Yeah, let's capture those comments, and just please, if you have uncertainty, note it by saying not sure, because there are some questions I think we can collectively answer in less of a theoretical space. Ahead in the polling, Kim, I'm thinking of the timeline.
Yeah. And so consistent across the consistent statewide, folks somewhat effective, a lot of folks unsure. Still want to collect the thoughts of everybody what information do you need? That's been really helpful for folks. And then the next question is, how effective do you believe the community-based implementation would be? Okay, thank you. And again, a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
I know DLCD will like to answer in the coming months throughout this process. Looking at timeline. So one of the questions is, how should the timeline for implementation of the map be set? And is that something that is driven by legislature, by subject matter experts in this area, set by communities, or not sure?
And I'll just chime in here, Kim, thank you. To Kurt's earlier point, there can be kind of a combination. So for example, with I think House Bill 2001, which was legislation that allowed for development of middle housing, specifically duplexes and in some places triplexes and quadplexes in areas that are currently zoned for single family development in communities, I think, that are over 10,000. So that's probably way too much detail, but there was a timeline set, and I can't remember if it was in the legislature or if DLCD established it in its rules, but we have seen working models of both. So we have seen places where legislation has passed that has phased something in, and how that would be phased, I think we could say that's a regional discussion, or it takes a different shape. It's a population-based discussion. But we could have it come through in legislation. We could say we trust these decision makers to sort of think through this on our behalf, and we will abide by that. When I say subject matter experts, or when we say that, really that would very likely, or at least in my mind, take the shape of the legislature saying, okay, DLCD go ahead and do, and they could either say on a timeline or not on a timeline, and then DLCD, if the latitude existed in the legislation, could consult with folks like the ones on this group, other state agencies, etc., to determine a timeline that seemed most appropriate given the information in the map and our need to protect communities. Or we could say, communities, you go ahead and decide your implementation timeline for this. Or it could be kind of a blend of the three.
And I want to draw attention also to Rachel's comment in the chat. She says these questions are very difficult to answer because while the map is advertised as mapping risk on tax lot scale, we really don't know how accurately that will reflect risk. If they reflect risk well, then we should have a statewide top-down implementation. If the map is more of a broad brush, then a community-based approach would be more effective. So if you have similar caveats to your answer and things that you would change your response based on how that map comes out at the end of June, please add those to the chat.
And Tim, if you're still on the call and you have any comment to offer in that regard, I'm sure we'd all benefit from your knowledge.
I was reading the comment there and was trying to find where the question was, since it posed that there's two approaches in the map, and currently with the methodology that is being used for that, we do have some instances. However, where we have some new areas is where the map is the direction of applying wildfire risk at a property ownership level, and that's going to have a nuance change into how that educational tool was previously used. So I think I think Rachel is it's a very valid comment for this approach, and waiting on where each individual tax lot of where that goes with the process and the risk assignments.
Thank you, Tim. And so here's the results from that, the setting implementation timeline. Folks largely very different opinions, no single winner, most folks being unsure. And then Charisse offered an additional comment saying that the types of subject matter experts would need to be identified. Subject matter expert as a category may not be going in as deep as she would like. So we have a final question, and this one is very long. And it's about our last consideration, which is really about where and what the map should be protecting. And it's 8. I'm putting up the whole question and we'll talk through it, and I'll ask Sadie and Susan to hop in as well. But there's these 8 categories that we identify that we want to ask, how important is it to you from your perspective, from your place in the world, that the map protect these categories? And you can write important, very important, important, not important, or not sure. And those categories include community lifelines, critical facilities, communication assets, and evacuation facilities that are vital to response. Second is cultural and heritage resources. The third is farm and forest land. Fourth is home, businesses, and other elements of the built environment. 5 is natural environment and ecosystem services. 6 is other natural hazards. 7 is socially and economically vulnerable communities. And 8 is preservation of development opportunities. So please just take this some time. We'll leave this up for a few minutes and let folks contribute.
So I'm having a hard time with this question because one, the map is a display tool, and this reads as if the map somehow we think we could change the map to be a regulatory tool to protect certain infrastructure. And I'm, again, not really sure what that means, because that's reading a whole lot into the statewide wildfire map in terms of being a regulatory tool. That is that outside of what DCBS and OSFM is using it for? Is that what we're talking about? Like how we could use the map to change the planning system to protect these resources? Is that what we're getting at here?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, so and again, so the poll, you can only have a short question, and we're trying to fit a lot on the slides, but just to say, yes. So if we have this map of wildfire risk, and then we are making recommendations for state and local land use planning programs about the types of regulatory requirements that may be considered in the future, are there factors or types of places or, things that are perhaps more important to protect than others? And
does that come with adoption of the map, or does that come with administrative, goal 7 rule changes that then local governments need to update their comprehensive plans? Because it's a distinction with a pretty important difference, because if just adopting the statewide map means that certain regulatory provisions apply, versus us as a group collectively talking about policy changes that may need to happen separate from the map. It's just very confusing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it is the latter. So this is just a way of, so our next 2 meetings, we are going to be talking about more at the policy level, development considerations and other policy considerations that we will, include in our recommendations. So just when we're thinking about the map being the thing that defines extreme and high risk and the location of the WUI. So with that in mind, once there is a map and we know where their areas are, as we're moving forward with policy recommendations, guided locationally by the map, but not regulatorily by the map, if that's a word. Changes, yes, under goal 7 or other, rules and state and local programs that could then be guided by the map. So the map is, again, not a regulatory tool for the land use work at this point. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, and Dave, please.
Just to follow up with Sam and Susan, I just want to make sure I understand I think I understand what you just said, and I thank you for saying that, but I'd like to just clarify. If I chose very important for, say, community lifeline and critical facilities, am I telling you or DLCD that I believe we should be making recommendations to the legislature to amend either the WUI map or the statewide risk map to specifically include these community lifelines and critical facilities as higher extreme risk or within the WUI? Is that what I'm asking, or is that what I'm answering? I don't really understand the question.
Susan, can I take a stab at it? I don't think, I think kind of what I'm thinking of when I look at this is maybe not what the map should protect, but what should be protected in general. So when I think about the things that Senate Bill 762 has requested in terms of recommendations from DLCD, one thing that Senate Bill 762 is silent on is any need for fire hardening standards for multifamily residential, right? That's not captured. It's just individual homes. Any need for fire hardening on healthcare facilities, or schools or churches, or any of these other commercial buildings, which could indeed put our communities at risk. So if I hear, or if we hear from this group, yeah, these community lifelines, these critical facilities, we should be protecting them, then you would certainly know about it, because these recommendations will come back to this group before we advance them in a report to the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council and the legislature. But one way I think we could interpret that is to say, maybe we need to consider some increased hardening standards for structures in addition to people's homes.
Sadie, I'm sorry, I gotta like throw a flag here because this group is about land use planning, not hardening standards, which is DCBS. That's way outside the scope of, I mean, a lot of us worked on this bill, what the point of this section was, which was to look at our planning system and how we're planning communities, not making recommendations on hardening standards. So I'm again confused as
I wasn't
it feels
there
like
for
the map is
drafting.
slightly being used to shoehorn kind of other things that are kind of outside the scope of what we're supposed to be doing under the bill.
Yeah, I wasn't there for the drafting process, but it does specifically say building standards and sufficient dispensable space. So I'm not sure how that made it in there. We're just trying to stay true to the legislation in our response.
Just as a follow-up, Sadie, we had extensive discussions in the WUI rack that a number of us on this call were on about critical facilities and how critical facilities played into the definition of structures, which were used to map the WUI. And so this discussion has been had and considered by the agency that's directed under Senate Bill 762 to prepare the maps. I'm not sure why DLCD is revisiting that issue.
Well, if I may just circle back to my earlier point, I think one benefit in having the conversation here is that critical facilities was used to determine where the WUI exists, but they are not considered in how they are protected from a hardened building standard or how they protect their neighbors and their community by having to sort of adhere to hardened building standards. And so there's a vulnerability piece that I think we're trying to get to in order to mitigate risk in communities with our recommendations. I see some hands up.
Yeah, Kelly, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to remind everybody to be mindful that this was kind of new territory, and so I think I guess some of the criticism that I'm kind of hearing, I would just caution that. I think DLCD is presenting some good information and presenting questions to the best of their abilities. So I would just caution that. I'm on the other side a lot where people in the community or council members are kind of doing the same thing. So I would just caution that moving forward. And so that we can kind of keep this a positive conversation. The second thing that I would like to point out is that I actually want to get into some of the stuff like hardening standards, because one of my roles is a planning director. The other one is overseeing the building division for our community as well. So I think it's a little too narrow of a scope to just say, let's stick in this one lane and not talk about anything else. Everything in this community that I help oversee of 13,000 people, I'm involved in planning, building, urban renewal, parks planning. The smaller the community, as a lot of you know, the more hat we wear. So I actually would appreciate talking about more than just land use planning in these conversations. So that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment, Kelly.
And Chad, please.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Chad Hawkins, Assistant Chief Deputy with the Oregon Office of State Fire Marshal. Just wanted to provide some clarifying comments on defensible space and public input, and just kind of aligning some of the principles we've been discussing here today and critical infrastructure. And, when we talk vulnerable populations in the fire code world, we actually have a definition for the implementation and development of the defensible space code that actually caps all critical infrastructure that we're issued a C about. So our multifamily dwellings, multiple occupancy structures, and things along those lines, as far as defensible space is concerned. So I just wanted to provide, not only that clarifying comment, but that we're still in the process of developing the defensible space code, and therefore there is public input. As Dave alluded to, a lot of the agencies have been working together. Our next meeting is actually tomorrow from 8:30 to noon on defensible space code development. And again, all of that information is available on our website, but it is pretty consistent with subject matter expert work with all those state agencies from the local level all the way up to the state and even federal partners. So that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Chad. That's really helpful. I don't think that I had considered the scope of defensible space the same way that we kind of got into some details with the building codes division in our conversation there. So that's really helpful. Appreciate that comment.
So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll on what the map should protect. I think as Charisse very aptly put it in the comments in the chat, this is a values question and conversation as well. So I'm going to share the results, and I think very overwhelmingly, community lifelines and critical facilities being protected by implementation of the map came across as very important, as well as cultural and heritage resources and socially and economically vulnerable communities is very important. Nothing was overwhelmingly ruled as not important by this group. I think that tracks and makes sense given that these are all things that folks value. But a lot of things came in as more on the important side, whereas critical facilities, cultural and heritage resources, homes, and socially and economically vulnerable communities were some of the highest ranking items in this. Thank you for participating. And Charisse, please.
I just wanted to point out that one of the questions, which was not a value, was natural hazards. And it's clear what you were trying to get at there, which is why I provided the comment that wildfire can create natural hazards like accelerated erosion on a massive scale that would wipe out your watershed. So the real value there was basically the watershed. So if you were to pose these questions again, it's like apples and oranges. It was very hard to figure out how to respond. You're looking at vulnerabilities, that set of questions, values, different set of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Charisse. And thank you all for participating in the polling and for this wonderful conversation. And I think, Tammy, you can pull back up the slides. We'll go to the next slide. We covered that topic. And Susan will take it from here.
Yeah, thanks everyone. That was a very helpful conversation. So I appreciate everybody's viewpoints. So again, we are charged with helping make recommendations. And I did put it in the chat, the actual language from Senate Bill 762. And I'm going to just scroll back up, but maybe I won't, but just the, recommendations of how the map will be incorporated. So that is part of our charge. So that's, yeah, so I'm going to just read this. The DLCD shall identify updates to statewide land use planning program and local comprehensive plans and zoning codes that are needed in order to incorporate the wildfire risk map and minimize wildfire risk. So what we were really trying to get at with the poll questions and the conversation, different considerations around incorporating the wildfire risk map. So really, timeline and how it's adopted and at what level. So that's what we were trying to get at, rather than any changes to the map. So I just want that to be clear. And so now we are going to talk a little bit about how we could think about using the risk map to inform land use planning, which I think is what a lot of folks want to get to. And we will talk more about actual development considerations at our next two meetings. But really, this will help us develop the recommendations that we'll be bringing back to the group for further discussion. How the map can be incorporated and help to minimize wildfire risk. So next slide, please. Let's see. Oh, Dave had a good comment, but we can address goal 5 on another meeting date. But so you all were asking for a map. So I just want to be super clear. So here is a screen capture from the existing advanced Oregon Wildfire Risk Explorer from May 13th of this year that shows the existing wildfire risk levels. So this is, if you can see the legend, this is the overall wildfire risk. It's at the top of the Explorer when you open it, if folks want to look around. This is a community in Southern Oregon, and we're really just showing this as an example of what a wildfire risk map looks like generally. So again, to be super clear, this Oregon Explorer right now has different levels of risk than what is required under Senate Bill 762. They actually show some benefit and then have the three other risk categories. But really just to show here's an urbanized area, a city that is surrounded by areas identified as having wildfire risk or possible benefit. Again, this is the example from now. And so really just a screenshot in time. So next slide, please. So I think being a land use planning agency and talking about land use with you all, we did want to take a little bit of time to talk about ways that the map could potentially in the future, no changes to the map, but be used to inform changes to comprehensive plan maps and zoning, which is the implementing ordinance for comprehensive plan maps. So some examples could include things like, base zone district changes, rezones, overlay or transect zones. The wildfire risk map, could be used to direct where plan development standards might come into play, and things like transfer of development rights. I know that there are folks in the room who aren't planners or familiar as much with land use planning. And so I have one of the documents we shared before our first meeting is a wonderful resource from the American Planning Association called Planning the Wildland Urban Interface, the PAS report from 2019. And it really gives a great overview of how zoning can be used to reduce risk. So to allow communities to direct growth away from highest wildfire risk areas, or sometimes it can be used to limit the intensity and density of development within certain areas that are extreme or high wildfire risk within the wildland urban interface, for example. So these are kind of some hypothetical ways that risk could be incorporated. So we have base zones that are really just the basic standards regardless of geographic location. An overlay zoning district might have specific standards that apply to a particular geography, regardless of the base zoning district, or something like a planned development. There may be negotiated standards that apply just to that particular site and development proposal. So as I mentioned, a base zone district can be used to look at or direct or require certain types of standards for that district. For example, a low density, large lot residential zoning district might be more appropriate in an area of moderate wildfire risk, whereas a higher density multifamily zoning district may not. So if we're looking at things like evacuation and ability to include, I don't want to bring up defensible space standards again, because we're talking about moderate risk, but just kind of more broadly speaking, practices that would reduce risk for that development, such as, adequate safeguards like limiting outdoor storage of firewood or propane, or other provisions. Rezones may be used to provide zoning during an annexation process or through other rezoning, and at that point, more stronger wildfire standards could be applied. An overlay zone, those are actually being used quite a bit around in Oregon, to protect communities at risk for wildfire. And I had saw Kyle put a question in the chat a while back about how Deschutes County has, they've used overlay zoning across the county. And the overlay could be overlay properties within a certain level of risk based on a map where certain standards would apply. And then if there's less granular data, an applicant may have to look at more site-specific analysis to determine what standards might apply. And that is similar to what we were talking about with the floodplain mapping. So that kind of, it's a broad map that says there's a risk, and then you want to come in and develop, then more specific analysis might have to be done for that site. Another potential type of zoning is a transect zone, and also mentioned Deschutes County. They adopted an applicant-initiated comprehensive plan and zoning tax amendment in 2019, and a zone change of 700 acres of land from urban reserve and surface mined to the new West Side Transect zone. And so in that new zone in Deschutes County, residential subdivisions are required to have dedicated open space and resource management corridors with funded and enforceable provisions for the management of wildlife habitat and wildfire prevention mitigation plan. So that's an example where a transect zone could potentially make sense for wildfire risk reduction. And then I did talk a little bit about the planned developments. And then lastly, I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but there is a transfer of development rights process where areas with high or extreme risk may be looked at as an area where we don't want density. And if you have a robust transfer of development rights program, that development opportunity could potentially be transferred to another area or a receiving area in a community or watershed. These are done in different ways where additional development density would be accepted. Transfer of development rate programs can be take a lot of staff resources and administrative attention than other growth management or hazard mitigation tools. But King County, Washington actually has a robust transfer of development rates programs around wildfire risk that is a potentially good example to look at. So I think we have our next slide. We're going to talk a little more about urban growth boundary expansion and how the risk map might be used there. But I'm happy to take a moment. I see there's a lot of chat, which I haven't been looking at, but just take some questions, or we're not doing any more polling, but we just want to have some discussion on these topics. So, Mary Kyle.
Thanks. You've mentioned a few things from examples from other places. You just said King County and Deschutes County. Maybe there are a few others. I would find it useful if you could send those examples to us to read through prior to our next meeting. So
sure.
That seems to give some concrete examples of what we might want to consider.
Yes.
Thanks.
And I'm also hoping for one of our June meetings, and I haven't heard back from them, but to have someone from the city of Ashland come and talk about what they're doing there. And then I see Kyle kindly put in the chat that he's happy to answer questions also about the Deschutes County West Side Transect Zone. So I can send links to all of that.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And Ashland and Deschutes County, a city and a county, is a good contrast there. Thank you.
And let's see, Kurt is asking for more examples as well. Yeah, okay, great. All right, Sharice. Sharice, did you have a question or comment?
Yes, I'm sorry, I was on mute.
Oh, no problem.
I was having some difficulty trying to respond because I wasn't sure exactly what you're looking for. So I wrote down some examples of things that came to mind. Maybe you could respond to these and let me know if this is what you're after. First of all, to be able to respond appropriately through planning, there needs to be an outline of the characteristics of risk in communities by density or proximity of homes. For example, the risk varies between 400 homes per square kilometer versus less than that or more than that. So the planning zones and the actions that are taken require us to understand risk in developed areas. And I don't see that clearly identified as something that the planners are doing, but it probably is. Then there are certain things that are standards, and I apologize, but I don't use the term defensible space. I know it's what's in code right now or in the language that we're using. I prefer fire adapted communities because there are actions that we can take to enable our homes to avoid being burned, whether there's somebody there or not. When we use the term defensible space, it implies that somebody's there to defend it, either the homeowner or the fire department, and that's no longer a realistic expectation. So that's an aside on my soapbox. But some of the things that are applicable, if you consider the fact that you can set standards that help homes survive. Home hardening is one of those examples that was talked about extensively relative to building codes, but I haven't heard much about landscaping standards. And if there isn't much coming out there, I think we could add a lot through this working group. For example, prohibiting extremely flammable plants, identifying and agreeing on what those might be, and saying there should be prohibited in certain communities. Any kind of prohibition needs to be spatially relevant, so it's a bigger discussion. Bark mulch, for example, is not recommended within 0 to 5 feet of structures if they're cement sided, and 0 to 10 if they're made with cement board. Another thing is fencing materials. I don't know if that's going to be covered under building codes. It's certainly what we are dealing with in Ashland in terms of new ordinances. But these are all things that apply largely dependent on the proximity of buildings and the kind of features they have. And those are all the kinds of things that planners regulate often in communities. I don't know if any of that is relevant, but those are my thoughts off the top of my head.
Thank you. I think that's all very relevant. So these are the types of conversations we're trying to get at. I don't see any more questions. All right, thank you. Next slide, please. So the other area where we're hoping to get some feedback, again, broadly without a map in hand, and understanding that is really challenging for all of us. We've talked looking at land use planning. We currently have processes through which hazards and other considerations are looked at like during a process for an urban growth boundary expansion, for example. And here, some examples for that. There are other hazards, steep slopes and other natural features that are considered, for example, when evaluating land that is suitable and available for housing and other growth under housing needs analysis, which is now housing capacity analysis or assessment, I believe. The name has changed. And so I wanted to have some conversation around whether wildfire risk is something that this group thinks should also be considered when looking at areas that could potentially accommodate future growth. And also, are there additional fire protection or other resources or infrastructure, for example, that could be required during, an urban growth boundary expansion or an annexation process that would be needed to serve higher risk areas. For example, fire protection. If an area community doesn't have fire protection district that can serve increased development in a certain area, then what types of requirements could kick in to make that area more fire adapted. So some big questions, but hoping just to have a little conversation around that. Samantha.
Um, I think, so Samantha Vera, I work for the Oregon Home Builders Association. We would have substantial concerns about the fire risk map being used for UGB expansions. What we know to be true right now is that UGB expansions are an already incredibly difficult process. We just had a budget note last session from the legislature to look at this exact issue to try to determine if there's ways to make it a easier process and to look at our land supply issues. And I think it would be ill-advised of this group to make any suggestions on UGB expansion while that work is underway, simply because we run the risk of having the left hand doing something while the right hand is doing something different. I would say additionally, we're in the middle of a housing crisis. And if you look at the Wildfire Explorer risk map, which I think someone put in the link, what you have right now, which doesn't even include the new risk map, is you have full counties like Jackson County and Josephine County, the Bend area outside of Eugene, areas like Hood River, the Dalles are covered in red. I mean, it is really scary to look at. And those are a lot of the cities that are trying to grow and provide housing for its citizens. And so I think it's a really scary topic for housing advocates to think that we may be precluding any areas where UGB expansion and more housing to go simply because of a fire risk. I know that seems slightly insensitive because fire risk is a very big deal, but that's why we have hardening standards. That's why we have community fire-wise communities. And so I would just really be cautious of this.
Thank you. Kelly.
Yeah, I actually disagree with that. If we're looking from a planning perspective, UGB analysis and preservation of Senate Bill 100, I think, is one of the most important things we should be considering during this process. I get where Samantha's coming from, because that's what that organization is for, is to promote more housing and make it easier to develop more housing. But I would push back on that. If we are looking at higher risk areas, I do think we do need to do an assessment during UGB expansion process. I've done 2 UGB expansions, and she is correct, they are very robust and time consuming, but I think that's on purpose, as I said, to protect Senate Bill 100 and the charging statements behind all the Oregon land use planning goals. So I think it should be open for consideration. I think that's something we should be looking at.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Mary Kyle.
I think the question here is simply, should wildfire risk be considered in an analysis of natural hazards when looking at whether a place is suitable and available for housing and other growth? And of course it should be. I mean, that's how we take into account a steep slope, for example. It might or might not preclude development there, but it is a consideration as to whether or not, and if so, how, and under what conditions. And fire, an analysis of natural hazards, is our wildfire risk is also an unnatural hazard, human created, but it exists, and pretending it doesn't, I don't think we serve anyone by not taking that into account in where we develop and how we develop, whether through UGB expansion or through, I'm actually more concerned about the exurban sprawl development that's outside urban growth boundaries, that I hope we get a chance to talk about at some point. But and fire protection should be considered like any other infrastructure. Do we have the infrastructure there to protect people who are living there? Because we're not doing service to people if we're allowing development in places that are going to be risky to a certain level. This doesn't, we have 5 gradations of wildfire risk. We have a WUI. I think these are things to be considered and to figure out again, whether, if so, how. So I don't know how. It is a risk, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. Wildfire risk exists, and it's pretty public where it is. So I think we should meet it and figure out how to deal with it.
Thank you, Mary Kyle. And Susan, just letting you know, we've got 12 minutes left. I want to make sure we reserve 5 minutes at the end to talk about next steps.
Yeah. Any other questions? I'm also kind of, Kim, if you see any specific questions in the chat, it looks like more of, let's see. There's some great comments. Just kind of looking through. Yeah.
Kelly and Kurt both weighed in with additional comments as well in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Oh, we have a comment from Court.
Yes. Court, please go ahead.
Thank you for the time. I don't know why my screen's not coming on, but sometimes the greater risk, a lot of people believe, is just as we head towards poverty. We are desperate in our county. I'm very glad to hear the last speaker mention Josephine and Jackson counties. You know, sometimes desperate is an overused word, but we have people that live in their cars. And, you know, I know I'm stating the obvious, but when it comes to the urban growth boundaries, the realization, or at least a lot of people think the reality is, there's no flexibility in that whatsoever. So developers get frustrated, and you know, people just don't have a place to live. So that's my only comment. I'm watching this really close, and boy, housing is the risk of the lack of housing is almost getting to be the equal to, in terms of priority, with the catastrophic wildfire issues. So thank you for that time. Very much appreciated.
Great point. Thank you so much. All right. Anybody else? I'm going to scroll back up. Oh, let's see. Sadie answered a Rubiel's question in the comments. Thanks, Sadie. All right. And Samantha is encouraging folks to look at the Wildfire Risk Explorer. And again, this is, you know, the current risk. And we will have more information in June about the updated map and underlying data. All right, I think, Kim, if we don't have any more questions, we can go to the next slide. All right, so this is another, this could be another very long conversation. We are running up against time, but we do have in Senate Bill 762, you know, that DLCD could consider regional differences. And so, you know, we have an opportunity here to talk about that a little bit, and we will come back to a lot of this conversation, because as we are looking more specifically at, you know, development standards and other policy discussion, I think that this will play into those conversations. But just to know, you know, if we are talking about regional differences, you know, under Oregon's statewide land use planning program, we already have some precedent around regions in terms of east and west of the Cascades, how those different broad regions are used for farm and forest rules. There's also, you know, regionality that could become more evident when we're looking at the risk map, you know, based on risk and the WUI. Another way to look at regions could potentially be where there are population densities most at risk, as well, you know, as other considerations. And so really understanding people's ideas around kind of regional differences, I think is more around how the recommendations look at how local governments might use the map, or it might be phasing how, you know, a program is rolled out across the state, and timing and things like that. So I'm curious if folks have thought about this regional differences piece at all, and if you have any thoughts about ways the map might inform regional implementation differences. And if not, think about regional differences as we're going through our next couple of meetings, and we can definitely circle back to that.
Maybe just go to the next slide and talk about our last consideration.
Oh, yes. Also, another really big question. We saved all the big ones for the end, but you know, if folks have ideas right now, and again, we will have a follow-up survey and continue to have these conversations as we're moving forward, but other implementation considerations that folks think are important for DLCD to explore. All right, Mary Kyle, please.
I alluded to this in my last question, and which is, are we going to at some point talk about how this applies to uses and activities permanently or temporarily permitted in farm and forest zones? I mean, I think of, for example, large gatherings that are temporary uses of, maybe several thousand people at a music concert in August in a high wildfire risk area. Should we be rethinking the locations or conditions under which some things are allowed, if at all?
Mm-hmm. Great point. Mm-hmm. And let's see, Kelly, yes, I saw another hand. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, I think everything land use wise should be on the table at this point, because if our ultimate goal is to protect people and their property and our natural environment all at the same time, I think the only way to do that is to look at all options available. And I just wanted to say, I agree with a lot of people that were saying we're in a housing crunch. I'm not denying that with my comments earlier. My comments more stem from, I'm native Oregonian. I've lived here all my life for 40 years, and I don't want to lose what Oregon has. And just because there's development pressure, I don't think that should outweigh the considerations for keeping Oregon the beauty and the gem that it is. I think that's a lot of the reason why people move here. So I fully recognize we're in a housing crunch, rising interest rates, house costs. It's really insane. But I don't think those things should, those things are not more important than the risk assessment that we need to do associated with wildfire. And I think we just need to be cognizant of that. And thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kelly. Rubio?
Yes, so I guess for me, the biggest issue would be access. The accessibility to be able to get to these maps, to the digital forms, what platforms are they? It really makes a difference. Are they translated? Are they in Spanish? There are a lot of things that are in place to be able to reach out to the majority. For example, taking Detroit, for example, it really highlighted the fact that you need to have a map that is easily translated and able to communicate the dangers, basic as that. So I'm going to advocate for access and accessibility, but it seems there is a layer of, it feels like I need to go through a lot of layers to be able to get to the access points that are accessible on a cell phone. And on top of that, they need to have internet access, which I am suffering from some of that myself. So there is some reality checks here besides having a wonderful map that can tell me my exit route whenever in cases of fire, a wildfire fire. But we can pick a right on this and use this as a community engagement tool to really allow people to access and allow them to have the information. And even if it is a community engagement through that platform, it can work, but the access points it's just a sad thing to see in many ways and shaping forms that I can explain. But
thank you so much for that comment, Rubio. That is very powerful. Unfortunately, I think we are out of time for this afternoon, Kurt and Evian, but if you wouldn't mind sharing your comments in the chat so we can capture them and everybody can hear what you're thinking.
Right. I mean, besides that, just the accessibility for people to access to it, and I keep fighting with you guys to be able to create those moments. So yes, thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Tammy, if you go to the next slide. Susan, you want to talk about our next steps?
So here's the list of our upcoming stakeholder group meetings. And as I noted, we will have a survey that we'll send out later this week, which will, in addition, we're capturing all of the comments. The meeting's being recorded, everyone's taking notes, as well as the chat. It'll be another way to share, any additional ideas or concerns, or things that maybe we are missing. And so that will be coming out soon. We also want to encourage you to continue to share the link for wildfireadaptedoregon.com so folks can look at the online open house and take the survey, which will also help with our recommendations. And next slide, please. And then again, here is just our overview of our project. We are beginning to work on a report with draft recommendations. The timeline is very tight, but we will be sharing report, very draft report with the Land Conservation and Development Commission in July, after we have our June meetings with this group, and then also with the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council. We're getting feedback as we go along, and then we'll come back to this group in August to refine, finalize the recommendations report, and then have that available on October 1 for the legislature and the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council. And I think, yeah, so the thank you slide. Again, thank you everybody for your time today. Really great conversation, some hard questions. I think we all really appreciate everybody feeling able to express different points of view. And if there were things that you didn't feel comfortable, sharing on camera or in the chat, again, those are that's great feedback that you could share in the survey as well. So I think that's all I have, and I again wanted to thank everybody for their time and their thoughtful conversation. We really appreciate it.
And thank you, Kurt and Evan, for putting your comments in the chat.
Yeah, great. All right, thank you all.
Have a good afternoon.
Bye.
Thank you so much for your
Thank you.
time.
Thank you.
Really great conversation.